So, I want to talk about death, but before I do that, I feel like I should. I feel like I need to give an orientation to my sort of spiritual framework. So this might be a two-parter. Um, and so because so I meditate on death a fair amount. And if you're not familiar with death meditations, might be something to look into if it speaks to you in some way. It's a thing. Um, but part of why that is it's just part of my signature of who I am, and it's also deeply rooted, or it's sort of integral to my own spiritual paradigm, I guess, is the way to put it. And so uh, let me share a little bit about that with you. And then hopefully, as I like, if you, hopefully, then this kind of serves as like a reference point for some of the future conversations that I might have about death, or, you know, more sort of esoteric or spiritual types of subjects. I am very into astrology, and very much from the lens of this fascination, like this sort of like semi intellectual and then also like spiritual fascination with just human evolution, and the idea, or like the knowledge that we have that every human society, as far back as we can trace them, has had their own cosmology based off of the night sky, right? And so the constellations might be structured a little bit differently, but all of them developed a sort of mythos and archetypal cosmology that factored in like fixed stars, and often the same fixed stars, because of what it's we all see, more or less the same night sky, um with nuances. but um but they also factored in the planets, right? And so, as these sort of like moving, like the wandering stars, as they have been called in some cultures. And so, what's fascinating to me about that is that, without necessarily having like significant interaction, you know, I'm of the mind that the ancient civilizations actually did have interactions with each other across continents, even if it wasn't, fully mapped out or documented. Like, it might have been much less than what we have access to now, and with maybe a less clear understanding. But I don't think everybody was in isolation. And also just the process, or the thing, the phenomenon, the human phenomenon of making meaning, right? Of looking at the night sky, observing the patterns of what happens, as what you like, because you can see more of the patterns of the shifts of what happens amidst the stars and the constellations, and how the earth rotates, and what we're able to see as seasons change and time marches on. There's this like conversation that unfolds between a human collective, society, culture, group, and what they're observing, and how that correlates to what's happening in their environment, to weather patterns, to events, and agriculture, and personal experiences, right? Sort of personal trends and patterns. The menstrual cycle, like all of these things, right? There's a noticeable correlation. And so all of these humans came up with their own system of sort of documenting it and tracking it and interpreting it. And so, Western astrology is just one of many forms of that form the basis for so many aspects of human culture, especially when it comes to like planning and agriculture and, structure, as well as spirituality and making meaning. Um, so all of that to say, like my fascination with these systems comes from that sort of curiosity around the human condition and how we function as humans. And through that has also sort of led me to this deeper understanding of, how I want to engage with it and how I engage with it for myself. So with my spiritual practice is very much based off of planetary devotion. And so, I basically pay attention to what primarily the seven most visible planets, right? The ones that we were able to see as humans without the use of a telescope. And so that's, Mercury through Saturn. And then, factoring in Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, as needed, right? Because they all have, they all have their stories to tell. But I basically work with those sort of the 5 planets and 2 luminaries, the moon and the sun. And so I have like this devotional practice, and I engage with it primarily through the Greco-Roman pantheon, because that's the orientation that I have and sort of approached this system of understanding through. But part of why I elevate the planets and sort of focus on, the planet themselves is because it translates to the different cosmologies in different ways. There's nuances, there's slight differences in the stories, and you'll notice sort of like what they call sort of like syncretic integrations of mythologies, which basically means, for example, Venus Aphrodite in the Greco-Roman tradition absorbs some of the mythologies and stories of Ishtar, or Inanna in Sumerian tradition. And so, right, like, and Inanna and Ishtar have their own stories that are different than, Venus Aphrodite, but the traits and the qualities get absorbed. You see those parallels more clearly as these cultures engaged with each other, fought with each other, conquered each other, that kind of a thing, and sort of adopted each other's traditions in different ways, or colonized each other's traditions in different ways, depending on, which culture we're talking about, which entity we're talking about. And so, but they're all still linked. Like, so much of their mythology is linked to the planets, right? So, with Venus and Inanna, like, there's the correlation of the Venus retrograde cycle. So the cycle of Venus, where there's every 1.5 to 2-ish years, the planet will retrograde, which basically means that, from our viewpoint on Earth, the planet will have been moving in one trajectory. It will appear to stop, and then it'll go back, and then come around again, and then go back direct, and then continue on their trajectory, right? So that's what it looks like from Earth. It's not what's happening. It's just an optical illusion, right? Astronomically speaking. But that cycle, that pattern, is a roughly 40-day pattern, and Venus transitions from being morning star to evening star, or evening star to morning star. I get that confused a little bit, I'll be honest with you. But so that correlates to, the myth of Inanna descending into the underworld and passing through the 7 gates to meet with her sister Ereshkigal, and dying, and then coming back to life and re-emerging after 40 days and 40 nights of going through this trial and tribulation. And, as you hear this, I'm sure that you can identify other parables and myths and legends about a transformational experience that lasted 40 days and 40 nights, right? So there are these parallels of how we make meaning with things and what that means and what that translates to our own experience and how that shows up for us in different ways. And so when, for me, for my like for how I make meaning, and what was helpful for me in this was developing a relationship with my environment, with the like with the sky, with the cosmos, right? That felt accessible without feeling, what's the right word? Like dogmatic, but I feel like there's probably some vocab term that I'm not clicking with. But it's, there's not this sort of power differential that happens in some of the more institutionalized religions where you have to go through an authority figure to access, your divine connection, right? I don't ascribe to that belief. I think we all have direct divine connection. And I think the more that we engage with it and tap into it, the more it allows us to be present in the moment, to feel supported. And as we navigate the trials and tribulations of being human, because at the end of the day, like, I don't know about you, but I think I find myself thinking a lot about what it means to be human and what does any of this mean, right? And if this is what it means to be human, what do I want that to look like? What do other humans need and want? Like what does it mean to be human, to exist on this earth as a social creature that has so much awareness and cognitive capacity and ability to do and create and make so many things, as much as we have the ability to destroy and annihilate and undo so many things, right? So what does that mean, right? It's very existential. Yeah. So me and existential crises and me and existential questions go way back. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And so again, forming this more relational dynamic with the world around me, with my environment, it was born out of trying to sort of go back to my roots, right? And understand where I came from and who I came from, and, what does indigeneity even mean anymore for, a descendant of immigrants and exiles and, and indentured servants and slaves. You know what I mean? Like, what does that mean? What does that even mean anymore? And so that was a journey. That was a big journey. And it led me to this type of spiritual practice that felt a little bit more connective and supportive, and a way of integrating both self-knowledge and self-awareness and self-exploration with collective awareness and collective exploration and connection, and and being in a context bigger than myself, not just spiritually, but also, physically, socially, emotionally, all of the things, right? So having this really more integrated, multi-systemic way of understanding myself and the world in which I exist. So that is, I don't know if that made sense to anybody. That is generally my sort of spiritual orientation. Um, I could like I have practices within it. There are relationships that I've developed with, what I would consider more than human concepts, or deities, or what, like, however you want to call it, right? And so if that's like, let me know if that's interesting to you. I'm hesitant to really get too deep into it because, again, I'm not a dogmatic person. I think everybody has their own journey and needs to operate within a framework and a paradigm of making sense of the world that works for them. And so if you are atheist, if you are, uh, you know, somebody who, like, scientist in the terms, like, in terms of scientism, not scientist as like the occupation, I think that's valid, right? That's your way of making meaning, and it serves you. And so I'm not here to like debate it. So, but I came to my own conclusions, and I went through my own journey and my own process, and that's something that I generally support and advocate for people to do, because I think regardless of what paradigm you end up in, when it's a choice, right? When it's something that you have thought through and explored and questioned and criticized and analyzed and sort of essentially interrogated to determine if a, like, the sort of the structures or the rituals or the sort of systems in which, like, the practices make sense to you, and then the relationship, is that something that serves you and is healthy for you and supportive to you. And if the answer to that is yes, right? If the answer to that is, this makes sense to me, or this works for me and, has helped me and continues to help me, then, I'm not going to fix what's not broken. You know what I mean? For you. And if the answer is no, then, if you run into these questions, or if something stops making sense, or if it doesn't feel right or good or constructive or supportive to you, then I think it's worth looking at other options. You know what I mean? It's worth questioning. We are given these incredible brains and capacity for cognition and awareness that we have, in part so that we can critically think about ourselves and our environment, and find ways of existing that are supportive to ourselves and to each other and the world around us. So I like that is, to me, that is the point. That's part of the point of making meaning, and that's part of why we are biologically driven to try and make sense of things, right? Is because we're trying to contextualize our existence and the environment that we are in part for survival, like, to make sure that there's not a threat, or that we are able to recognize and distinguish from threat from safety, right? Threat from aid, threat from non-threat, right? From something neutral. So again, I just think it's important to question and explore for yourself what your system of meaning, or what your paradigm for making meaning is. And I don't think there are wrong answers. I think there are behaviors and actions that I disagree with, but that's a different story, right? There's sort of practices that I might not, fully endorse or agree with. But again, it's a journey and a process that's unique to each person. So anyway, all of that to say, I'm happy to share more about my own practice if that is interesting to you, or if you're curious about it. But generally speaking, I would advocate for exploring for yourself. And so, I'm sure you'll get hints of sort of how I came to the paradigm I came to. But as we talk. But anyway, I'll see you when I see you.